The Germans had a nickname for American soldiers in early 1943. They called them cowards. They called them soft. They said Americans were the Italians of the Allied forces, all equipment and no fight. German officers openly laughed about how easy it was to defeat them. British commanders quietly agreed, suggesting that perhaps Americans should stick to logistics while real soldiers handled the actual fighting. But here is what nobody saw coming. In just 27 days, the United States Army would undergo a transformation so complete, so rapid, and so devastating that German commanders would never mock American soldiers again. 27 days from total humiliation to absolute victory. Less than 4 weeks from the worst defeat in American military history to the first decisive triumph over German armor. How did that happen? What changed in those 27 days that turned a retreating, demoralized, scattered force into an army that stopped elite German panzers cold? And why has this incredible story been almost completely forgotten? The morning sun had just crested the eastern mountains when Major General Terry Allen raised his field glasses and studied the valley below. It was March 23, 1943, somewhere around 6 in the morning, and the general stood in a forward command post about 3 miles west of a small Tunisian town called Guettar. The air was cool. The sky was crystal clear. Visibility stretched for miles in every direction, and through those field glasses, Allen watched 50 German tanks emerge from a mountain pass like steel predators descending on prey. Panzers, the machines that had crushed Poland in 3 weeks. The armor that had broken France in 6 weeks. The tanks that had driven deep into the Soviet Union and nearly captured Moscow. These were not ordinary soldiers in ordinary vehicles. These were the veterans of the 10th Panzer Division, men who had fought and won across 3 continents, men who had never lost a major engagement. They were coming for Allen's division. They were coming for the Americans. But here is where this story takes an unexpected turn. Because just 27 days earlier, American forces had been completely destroyed at a place called Kasserine Pass. They had lost over 6,000 men. They had retreated 50 miles in 5 days. They had abandoned tanks, artillery, trucks, and equipment across the Tunisian desert. The defeat had been so total, so embarrassing, and so public that the entire credibility of the American war effort was at stake. Now those same Americans were dug in across the Guettar Valley. Same army. Same soldiers, same equipment. But something was different. Something had fundamentally changed. What was it? What happened in those 27 days? To understand the miracle of Guettar, you first need to understand the disaster of Kasserine Pass. And I am not going to sugarcoat this. What happened at Kasserine was not just a defeat. It was a humiliation that should have ended careers and destroyed reputations. It was the kind of failure that makes historians wince and military officers study with morbid fascination. Picture this. February 19, 1943. The Atlas Mountains of Tunisia. A 2-mile-wide gap in a mountain chain called the Grand Dorsal. On one side, the legendary Desert Fox himself, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding battle-hardened German and Italian forces. On the other side, American troops who had arrived in North Africa just weeks earlier as part of Operation Torch. Most of these Americans had never fired a weapon in combat. They had trained in camps across the United States. They had practiced maneuvers in Louisiana and the Mojave Desert. They had shipped across the Atlantic expecting adventure and glory. What they got was a nightmare. The American commander was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and if you are wondering why you have never heard of him, there is a reason. Fredendall made virtually every mistake a commander could make. He positioned his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, hidden in a canyon, protected by tunnels that engineers had blasted into solid rock. The man was so concerned about his own safety that he barely knew what the actual battlefield looked like. But that was just the beginning. Fredendall split his forces into small, isolated groups scattered across 50 miles of desert. Military officers call this penny packeting, and it is essentially a recipe for getting your army destroyed piece by piece. Each small unit was alone, without support, unable to coordinate with adjacent forces. Want to know how bad the communication problems were? Each artillery battery operated on its own radio frequency. A forward observer with one battalion could only call for fire from that specific battalion's guns, even if another battery was closer, even if another battery had better firing positions, even if men were dying because the nearest artillery could not respond. There was no coordination. There was no unified command. There was just chaos waiting to happen, and Rommel knew exactly how to exploit chaos. When the German attack came, it came with overwhelming force and surgical precision. Panzer Mark IV tanks smashed through the pass. Their long-barreled 75 guns punched through American armor like it was made of cardboard. Italian forces supporting the attack swarmed over American artillery positions. American units that tried to retreat accidentally fell back into positions already occupied by the Germans. The American tanks were death traps. The M3 Lee and M3 Grant had silhouettes so high that they might as well have had targets painted on them. Their crews had never fought German armor. They had trained against other American tanks on flat training grounds. They charged forward in straight lines, exposed their flanks, and died in their vehicles without understanding what had hit them. The infantry had dug shallow scrapes in the ground instead of proper foxholes. They did not know that German tank commanders had a trick. They would deliberately drive their panzers over enemy positions and rotate the tracks, grinding anyone hiding below into the dirt. American soldiers learned this lesson the hard way. Many of them did not survive the education. Within hours, the American lines had collapsed. Fredendall could not coordinate a response because his units were too scattered. Artillery could not provide support because the batteries could not communicate with observers on different frequencies. Air support never materialized. The different American units did not even know where each other were positioned. It was a catastrophe. By nightfall on February 16th, the Second Corps had lost 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. And that was just the first day. The retreat continued for 5 more days as Rommel pushed American forces back 50 miles across the desert. Town after town fell to the German advance. American soldiers abandoned equipment, supplies, ammunition, and positions. When the German advance finally stopped on February 22nd, the butcher's bill was staggering. Over 6,000 American casualties, 300 dead, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 missing. The Americans had lost 183 tanks, more than 500 trucks and vehicles, over 100 half-tracks, and more than 200 artillery pieces. German losses: 989 casualties and 34 tanks. Let that sink in for a moment. The Germans had traded less than 1,000 men for over 6,000 Americans. They had traded 34 tanks for 183. It was not just a defeat. It was a massacre. The United States Army had suffered its worst single defeat of the entire war. But here is the question nobody was asking at the time. What do you do after a disaster like that? How do you take soldiers who just watched their friends die, who just retreated 50 miles in terror, who just got mocked by enemies and doubted by allies, and turn them into a winning army? Most military commanders would have asked for months to rebuild. The British Army had taken 3 full years to develop effective tactics against the Germans after their early defeats. The Soviets had needed 18 months after the German invasion to develop the operational competence they showed at Stalingrad. Even the Germans themselves had required extensive campaigns in Poland and France before perfecting their blitzkrieg tactics. Eisenhower did not have months. He did not have years. He had weeks. The Supreme Allied Commander in North Africa faced an impossible situation. If American forces could not fight the Germans on equal terms, how could they be trusted to lead the invasion of France? Winston Churchill was already skeptical about American military capability. After Kasserine Pass, his doubts seemed completely justified. British commanders Montgomery and Alexander concluded that Americans were hopelessly trained, poorly led, and unlikely to improve quickly. The future of the entire war hung in the balance. If Americans could not prove themselves in North Africa, the entire Allied strategy would need to change. British forces would carry the burden of the ground war in Europe. American troops would be relegated to garrison duties and logistics support. The arsenal of democracy would become a warehouse of supplies while other nations did the actual fighting. That was the situation on February 26, 1943, just 2 days after Rommel withdrew from Kasserine Pass. And that was the day Eisenhower made a decision that would change everything. He decided to fix everything, all of it, in less than a month. Now here is what makes this transformation so remarkable. Most organizations respond to catastrophic failure with denial. They blame individuals, they make excuses, they point fingers at circumstances beyond their control. Very rarely do they conduct a brutally honest assessment of what went wrong and then actually fix the systemic problems. Eisenhower did exactly that, and he started at the top. On March 6, 1943, Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command, just like that. No lengthy review, no second chances, no face-saving reassignment to some comfortable desk job. Fredendall was out, and everyone knew exactly why. The commander who had hidden in his canyon bunker while his men died in the desert was gone. But removing a failed general is the easy part. Finding someone who could rebuild a shattered army in less than 3 weeks is something else entirely. Eisenhower had one card left to play. A man so aggressive, so demanding, so utterly terrifying that soldiers would rather face German tanks than disappoint him. A 57-year-old cavalry officer who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this moment. A commander who believed that Americans properly trained and properly led could beat any army in the world. His name was George Patton. Patton took command of the Second Corps at 1000 hours on March 6, 1943. He had exactly 17 days before Eisenhower ordered his forces back into battle. 17 days to transform an army that had been humiliated, demoralized, and scattered across the Tunisian desert. What would you do with 17 days? Patton started with something that seemed ridiculous. He started with uniforms. Every soldier in the Second Corps was ordered to wear a complete, clean, pressed uniform at all times. Every single man. No exceptions. Soldiers who failed to wear leggings, helmets, or proper insignia faced court-martial. Officers who allowed their men to look sloppy were relieved of command on the spot. Patton personally drove through American positions looking for violations. He stopped jeeps in the middle of the desert. He inspected uniforms in the mud. He questioned soldiers about their weapons and their equipment. He fined officers $50 for not wearing neckties. $50 in 1943 was real money. He made enlisted men dig new foxholes because their old ones were too shallow to survive a German tank attack. The Second Corps absolutely hated him for it. Soldiers called him a tyrant. Officers complained that Patton cared more about appearances than combat. Some wondered openly if the general understood that they were preparing for a battle, not a parade. What possible difference could neckties make when German panzers were rolling toward you? But Patton understood something that his soldiers did not yet grasp. He was not really concerned with neckties. He was concerned with building a culture of excellence. And culture starts with the visible, the measurable, the enforceable. Think about it this way. If a soldier cannot be bothered to wear his uniform correctly, can he be trusted to maintain his rifle correctly? If an officer cannot enforce dress standards, can he enforce fire discipline? If an army tolerates low standards in one area, it tolerates low standards in every area. An army that looks sloppy thinks sloppy. An army that accepts mediocrity in small things accepts mediocrity in big things. Patton was not building an army that looked professional. He was building an army that believed it was professional. And belief matters. An army that believes it will win fights differently than an army that expects to lose. Confidence is not just a feeling. It is a tactical advantage. Something extraordinary started happening in those 17 days. Units that had been scattered and demoralized began functioning as cohesive teams. Soldiers started taking pride in their appearance and their equipment. Morning formations became precise. Weapons were cleaned and inspected daily. Vehicles were maintained to high standards. The casual, almost careless attitude that had characterized American forces before Kasserine Pass began to disappear. Men who had retreated in disorder started believing they could advance in order. Men who had been defeated started believing they could win. Patton gave them that belief through discipline, through standards, and through his own absolute confidence. He never doubted for a moment that his army would prevail, and slowly that certainty became contagious. But discipline alone would not win battles. While Patton was rebuilding morale, Eisenhower's staff was rebuilding doctrine. They were fixing the systemic problems that had caused the disaster at Kasserine Pass. The artillery reforms came first because American artillery was potentially devastating, but completely uncoordinated. American artillery pieces were excellent. The ammunition was plentiful. The gunners were well trained. The problem was that each battery operated in isolation. There was no way to mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target. German artillery was so effective precisely because German forward observers could call fire from any battery within range. They could create sudden, overwhelming concentrations of firepower that annihilated enemy positions. American artillery could never achieve that mass because of the communication problems. Within 1 week of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower's staff began developing new fire direction procedures that would allow better coordination across multiple batteries. Different frequencies were unified. Fire direction centers were established with connections to every battery. Artillery officers learned to think of artillery as a corps-level asset rather than a battalion-level asset. The technical challenges were significant. The training challenges were immense. But by mid-March, when the Second Corps went back into combat, the artillery battalions were practicing coordinated fire missions that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. The armor doctrine changes were even more fundamental. Before Kasserine, American tank doctrine emphasized tank versus tank combat. Tanks were supposed to fight other tanks. This came from the cavalry tradition, and it played directly to German strengths. German tank commanders had 3 years of combat experience. They had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. They knew how to maneuver, how to use terrain, how to concentrate fire, how to exploit weaknesses. American tank crews had no combat experience at all. Sending them against German panzers in direct combat was like sending amateur boxers against professional champions. Eisenhower's staff revised the doctrine completely. Tanks were no longer primarily weapons for fighting other tanks. Tanks were mobile fire support for infantry. Tank destroyers, not tanks, would fight German armor. This was what tank destroyer battalions had been designed for, but at Kasserine they had been broken up and scattered across the battlefield in useless penny packets. The new doctrine called for tank destroyer battalions to fight as unified battalions, concentrating their firepower at critical points. American forces would not try to beat Germans at their own game. They would play a different game entirely, one that suited American strengths. Air support reforms began but would not be fully solved until the Normandy invasion over a year later. Command structure reforms ensured that American divisions would fight together rather than being scattered in isolated groups. Every change was based on the specific lessons learned from Kasserine Pass. Do you see what was happening? 2 parallel transformations were occurring simultaneously. Patton was rebuilding the spirit of the Army, while Eisenhower's staff was rebuilding the brain of the Army. Morale and competence were advancing together. Neither would have worked alone. Together, they created something unprecedented. On March 17th, 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division moved forward into central Tunisia. Their objective was a town called Gafsa. Intelligence reported light defenses. American forces took the town with almost no opposition. The next day, the 1st Ranger Battalion pushed ahead and occupied Guettar, a small oasis town at the base of the mountains. Again, almost no opposition. Italian defenders retreated to the hills overlooking the town, blocking the mountain pass that led to the coastal plain. Now the 2nd Corps was in a critical position. If American forces could push through the Guettar Pass to the coast, they would cut off German forces in southern Tunisia from their supply lines. The enemy would be trapped between Americans advancing from the west and British forces advancing from the east. The German commander in Tunisia understood this immediately. General Hans-Joachim von Arnim could not allow Americans to break through at Guettar. He ordered a spoiling attack to drive the Americans back before they could threaten German supply lines. The force he chose for this attack was the 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations. Veterans who had fought across Europe and North Africa. Tank commanders with years of combat experience who had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles. Officers who had never lost a major engagement. The Germans planning the attack expected to crush American forces the same way they had crushed them at Kasserine Pass. They expected American units to scatter when hit by massed armor. They expected poor coordination. They expected weak artillery. They expected to be fighting the same army they had defeated 4 weeks earlier. They were about to discover how wrong they were. At 6 in the morning on March 23, 1943, 50 German tanks emerged from the mountain pass into the Guettar Valley. The morning sun was just rising behind the American positions, silhouetting the German column against the western mountains. Panzer Mark IV tanks led the advance, their long-barreled 75 guns clearly visible even at distance. Behind them came Marder tank destroyers, open-topped vehicles mounting powerful guns. Armored half-tracks carrying infantry followed in precise formation. Motorcycle scouts raced ahead to probe the American lines. The German column advanced at speed, engines roaring, tank treads churning up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. They were attacking across open ground approximately 2 miles wide, confident that American forces would break before they reached the town. They had seen Americans break at Kasserine. They expected the same result here. What they saw as they approached was nothing. Empty ground, silent hills, no movement, no resistance. What they did not see was an army waiting for them. Silent, disciplined, invisible, ready. Major General Terry Allen had positioned the 1st Infantry Division across the valley in depth, not in a single line that could be easily broken. Forward units occupied high ground with interlocking fields of fire. Behind them, infantry battalions held successive defensive lines, each capable of supporting the others. Artillery batteries waited behind the ridges, invisible to German observers but registered on every likely avenue of approach. American forward observers occupied concealed positions with clear views of the entire valley. Tank destroyer battalions were dug in and camouflaged so thoroughly that they were invisible from more than 100 yards. Infantry had proper foxholes this time, dug deep enough to survive tank attacks. Minefields had been laid at locations determined by studying exactly how Germans had attacked at Kasserine. Every unit knew where adjacent units were positioned. Radio frequencies were coordinated across the entire division. Fire direction centers had direct communications to every artillery battery. Ammunition was stockpiled. Medical stations were ready. Supply routes were secured. This was not the scattered, uncoordinated defense that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass. This was a prepared defensive position built according to the new doctrine, incorporating every lesson learned from that disaster. The German tanks rolled forward, maintaining formation, confident in their superiority. They had done this 100 times before. They knew exactly how enemies crumbled under the weight of panzer attack. At 400 yards from the American positions, the lead tanks hit the minefield. Explosions erupted beneath panzer chassis. Tanks lurched to a stop, tracks blown apart, crews scrambling to escape. The German column slowed, bunched up, as tanks in the rear tried to avoid the mines. Vehicles that had been spread across a wide front compressed into a concentrated mass. This was exactly what the American artillery observers had been waiting for. The order went out to every fire direction center in the sector, not just the batteries assigned to the 1st Infantry Division. Every battery within range. Fire for effect. What happened next was unlike anything the Germans had experienced from American forces. The first salvo landed with a sound like the world ending. High-explosive rounds detonated against tank armor. White phosphorus burst overhead, showering burning chemical that stuck to metal and flesh and would not stop burning no matter what you did. The second salvo landed before the first had finished exploding. Then the third. Then the fourth. The bombardment continued without pause, round after round after round, for 12 straight minutes. German tanks that had survived the minefield were hit repeatedly. Half-tracks with their thin armor exploded like firecrackers. Infantry who had dismounted to clear mines were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The few tanks that tried to retreat found their path blocked by disabled vehicles and continuing artillery fire. The German column was trapped in a killing zone, unable to advance, unable to retreat, being systematically destroyed by American artillery firing at maximum rate. This was the artillery coordination that had been missing at Kasserine. This was what American guns could do when they worked together instead of in isolation. This was the new doctrine in action, and it was devastating. When the artillery finally lifted, American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions. They targeted German tanks that were trying to reorganize after the barrage. The crews had trained for exactly this scenario. They had studied German tactics. They knew where to aim. They fired methodically, one tank at a time, waiting for clean shots. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion worked together, providing overlapping fields of fire. This was the unified employment that the new doctrine demanded, and it worked exactly as designed. The German advance collapsed completely. 30 tanks were destroyed or disabled by 9 in the morning. The 10th Panzer Division began withdrawing toward the mountain pass, leaving burning vehicles scattered across the valley floor. During the height of the battle, 2 German tanks actually approached Allen's headquarters. Staff officers nervously suggested that perhaps the general should withdraw to a safer position. Allen's response became legendary. "I will like hell pull out," he said, "and I'll shoot the first bastard who does." The Americans had won their first defensive victory against German armor, but the Germans were not finished. At 4:45 that afternoon, the 10th Panzer Division attacked again. This time they came from a different direction, trying to flank the American positions. They had regrouped, reorganized, and were determined to succeed where the morning attack had failed. The result was exactly the same. American artillery delivered mass fires on the German column. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions. German tanks were destroyed before they could close with American infantry. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had withdrawn permanently. They joined Italian forces in the hills east of Guettar, but made no further attempts to break through the valley. The men who had been routed at Kasserine Pass had just stopped one of Germany's elite panzer divisions. Cold. Can you imagine what that felt like? 4 weeks earlier, these same soldiers had been running for their lives, abandoning equipment, watching friends die in burning tanks. They had been mocked by enemies and doubted by allies. They had been called cowards. Now they were watching German tanks burn. The Battle of Guettar continued for 2 more weeks as American forces tried to push through the mountain passes. The fighting was difficult. Italian forces defending the high ground fought tenaciously, but the strategic situation had changed fundamentally. On March 26th, British forces launched Operation Supercharged II, breaking through German defenses to the east. The Axis position in southern Tunisia was collapsing. By April 7th, American forces from Guettar linked up with the British Eighth Army. The remaining German forces were trapped in northern Tunisia. The campaign was effectively over. The Germans noticed the change immediately. After Guettar, German commanders stopped calling American soldiers cowards. Intelligence reports acknowledged American tactical competence. Rommel, who had been recalled to Germany 2 weeks before the battle, later wrote that American forces had recovered very quickly after their initial shock and had succeeded in stopping German advances. The respect was grudging, but it was real. Americans could fight. So what made this transformation possible? How did an army that had been completely humiliated manage to rebuild itself in less than a month? This is the question that military historians have studied for decades, and the answers reveal something profound about how organizations can change. First, American forces accepted that they had a problem. There was no denial, no excuses, no blame shifting to convenient scapegoats. This might sound obvious, but it is extraordinarily rare. Defeated armies typically blame their soldiers for lack of fighting spirit. They blame subordinate commanders for tactical errors. They blame logistics for inadequate supply. They almost never blame doctrine, and they almost never question fundamental assumptions about how to fight. Eisenhower's staff conducted a brutally honest assessment of what went wrong. They identified specific failures in leadership, doctrine, and coordination. They published detailed reports that cataloged mistakes without sugar-coating anything. They did not blame soldiers for breaking under attack. They blamed themselves for putting soldiers in positions where breaking was inevitable. This honesty allowed them to focus on fixing systems rather than punishing individuals. Officers who had failed at Kasserine were reassigned to training positions where they could teach the next generation what not to do. Their experience, even their failures, became institutional knowledge. Second, American commanders had the authority to make changes quickly. Eisenhower did not need to cable Washington for permission to relieve Fredendall. He did not need War Department approval to revise artillery doctrine. He had been granted theater-level authority to command as he saw fit. This was fundamentally different from other Allied armies. British commanders answered to the War Office in London, where decisions required committee review and formal approval. Soviet commanders answered to Stalin, who made tactical decisions based on political considerations. German commanders increasingly answered to Hitler, who interfered in battlefield decisions from his headquarters thousands of miles away. American commanders in the field could change how they fought based on what they learned. This decentralization of authority was an American tradition dating back to the Revolutionary War, and it proved decisive in World War II. Third, American forces had the resources to implement changes immediately. New equipment arrived within weeks of being requested. Additional artillery batteries were formed and deployed. Radio equipment that did not exist in January was being manufactured in February and issued to units in March. No other nation could match American industrial capacity. British forces fought with equipment designed in the 1930s. Soviet industry had been devastated by the German invasion. German production was already being strangled by Allied bombing and resource shortages. Americans could request new equipment, new vehicles, new weapons, and receive them quickly. If something did not work, it could be replaced. This abundance enabled rapid experimentation. An army that must fight with inadequate resources cannot afford to experiment. An army with abundant resources can try new approaches, discard what fails, and scale up what works. Fourth, American forces learned from their enemies. Staff officers studied German tactics in detail. They analyzed how Germans coordinated armor, infantry, and artillery. They identified weaknesses as well as strengths. There was no pride, no insistence on doing things the American way simply because it was American. If the Germans did something better, Americans adapted it. Fifth, American forces emphasized training and repetitive practice. Patton's transformation focused heavily on basic skills. Soldiers practiced digging proper foxholes. Tank crews practiced coordinating with infantry. Artillery batteries practiced the new fire coordination procedures. The training was intensive and focused specifically on the problems identified at Kasserine. These 5 factors created something rare in military history, an institutional culture that valued adaptation over tradition. American forces were not bound by decades of established practice. They had nothing to defend, no institutional pride invested in proving that old methods worked. This was paradoxical. American inexperience, which had been a catastrophic liability at Kasserine Pass, became an advantage when it came to adaptation. Inexperienced forces learn faster because they have less to unlearn. The British never understood this. After Kasserine, British commanders concluded that Americans were hopelessly incompetent and unlikely to improve quickly. They had taken 3 years to develop effective tactics against the Germans. They assumed Americans would need the same amount of time. What they failed to grasp was that Americans learning in weeks what had taken the British years was actually a remarkable sign for the Allied cause, not cause for concern. The American learning curve was steeper and faster precisely because Americans were willing to admit failure and change course. The lessons of Kasserine and Guettar spread through the entire American military. Artillery coordination procedures became standard across all theaters. Combined arms doctrine was incorporated into training at bases across the United States. Tank destroyer employment was refined. Air-ground coordination improved steadily. By the time American forces invaded Sicily in July of 1943, just 4 months after Guettar, the improvements were already visible. By the Italian campaign in September, American forces were fighting with skill and confidence that would have been unimaginable at Kasserine. By Normandy in June of 1944, the transformation was complete. The American army that stormed the beaches of France was one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. They had superior artillery coordination, excellent air support, good combined arms integration, and experienced leadership. When they encountered new challenges like the hedgerow country of Normandy, they developed solutions within days rather than months. When they faced new German tactics, they adapted and overcame. The culture of rapid adaptation that had been forged in Tunisia became the defining characteristic of American forces in Europe. This was not because American soldiers were inherently superior. It was because the American military system encouraged and rewarded adaptation. The speed of American learning had strategic consequences beyond individual battles. By adapting faster than their enemies, American forces seized the tactical initiative. German commanders were constantly reacting to American innovations rather than implementing their own. They developed counters to American tactics only to find that Americans had already moved on to new methods. This created a tempo that German forces simply could not match. They were always one step behind, always responding to the last American innovation while the next one was already being implemented. The long-term impact extended far beyond World War II. The American military incorporated rapid adaptation into its institutional culture. After action reviews became mandatory, units were expected to identify problems and develop solutions. Commanders who could not adapt were relieved. The emphasis on learning from combat experience became a defining characteristic that continues to this day. Other militaries studied the American experience but struggled to replicate it. The British maintained their emphasis on tradition. Soviet doctrine emphasized centralized control. German military culture valued aggressive initiative but struggled with institutional learning. The American combination of decentralized authority, institutional flexibility, and systematic analysis remained unique. The transformation from Kasserine Pass to Guettar remains the fastest large-scale military adaptation in modern warfare. 27 days from humiliating defeat to decisive victory. Less than 4 weeks from tactical incompetence to operational effectiveness. The speed was unprecedented. The thoroughness was remarkable. The lasting impact was profound. Major General Terry Allen stood at his command post on the evening of March 23, 1943, and watched the last German tanks disappear back through the mountain pass. Smoke from burning vehicles rose across the valley floor. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the battlefield where German ambitions had died that morning. His division had won. American forces had won. The Germans who had mocked American soldiers 4 weeks earlier were retreating. The British who had questioned American competence would have to reassess. The Italians who had expected easy victory were digging in on the defensive, no longer attacking. Allen did not celebrate. There was more fighting ahead. The campaign in Tunisia would continue for 6 more weeks until the final Axis surrender in May. The war would continue for 2 more years. Many of the men who had survived Guettar would not survive what came next. But something fundamental had changed that day. American forces had proven they could adapt faster than any other army in the war. They had taken the worst defeat in their history and turned it into a template for victory. They had shown that failure was not permanent, that humiliation could become motivation, that an army willing to learn could transform itself with breathtaking speed. That was the real triumph of Guettar. Not just the tactical victory over the 10th Panzer Division, though that mattered. The real triumph was institutional, a victory over failure itself, a demonstration that American forces could learn, adapt, and overcome. The men who fought at Guettar did not know they were part of a historic transformation. They were focused on surviving the next German attack, on proving themselves after the shame of Kasserine, on showing that Americans could stand their ground against the best the enemy had to offer. They knew Patton was demanding and Eisenhower was watching. They knew the Germans considered them inferior and the British doubted their ability. They fought to prove everyone wrong. They succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The 1st Infantry Division stopped the 10th Panzer Division cold. American artillery crushed German armor with devastating effectiveness. American tank destroyers proved their worth when employed as unified battalions rather than scattered platoons. American infantry held their ground under conditions that would have broken them just weeks before. 27 days. That was all it took. 27 days to transform cowards into warriors. 27 days to turn retreat into advance. 27 days to prove that the United States Army could fight and win against the most experienced military machine in the world. The Germans never called American soldiers cowards again. And now I have a question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely? Our community stretches across the entire world, connected by a shared fascination with these moments when history turned on the actions of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Drop a comment and tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Every comment helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching American forces transform from humiliated retreats to triumphant defenders, hit that like button. That simple action tells the algorithm to share this story with others who would appreciate it. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories of transformation and courage, and the moments when everything changed, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are here every week with new episodes, rescuing forgotten stories from the dusty archives of history, bringing them back to life for a new generation. These stories deserve to be remembered. The men who fought at Guettar, who transformed themselves in 27 days, who proved that Americans could fight, they deserve to be remembered. And you are helping make that happen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And thank you for making sure these lessons, these transformations, these stories of courage and adaptation do not disappear into silence. 27 days changed everything, and now you know exactly how it happened.